thank you to the Shem Foundation for inviting me. It's also very nice to be in Findhorn, a place which I've heard about for many years but never visited before. As I said in my brief introduction earlier, one of the reasons I think it's important to think about epidemics, and pandemics in particular, is because they are weather vanes, because they tell us something important about the societies in which we live. But of course, this is not something which is an observation unique to me or unique to the present day. It's something which people have always, at least since recorded history, seen in epidemics. They've always searched for meaning in epidemics, wanting to know why now, why this community, why have I been affected, why have they, another community, not been affected. So the search for meaning is always an essential part of the way in which human beings have viewed epidemic diseases. By their very nature, epidemics and pandemics are diseases which affect not just individuals, but communities. And so the search for meaning is really a search for meaning on the basis of the community as a whole, as well as just the individual. And this is something which I think is probably common to most societies, and certainly true of most pre-modern societies. Basically, human beings tend to view their own societies through the prism of health and disease. They think about the durability of their societies in terms of their healthiness. They think about the crises in which their society is facing, or the impending crisis in terms of the disease, of the visitation, particularly of epidemic diseases. And very often, at times of extreme crisis, and of course diseases, epidemic diseases often occur along the same time as wars and other calamities such as famines. The arrival of an epidemic often seems to presage some sort of very broad social or even cosmological disorder. Now, in many pre-modern societies, there was a tendency to think about a golden age. And it's very interesting, when the golden age is imagined, it's always an age without disease, without grievous disease anyway, and particularly an age without any kind of epidemic visitations. And it's the golden age, or this age without disease, is often associated too with a state of innocence, and also with a state of balance within the human body, and also balance between the individual and the wider environment. And this, I think, is pretty typical of most pre-modern cultures. And of course, there are elements of this which survive even to the present day in many, particularly in many medical and philosophical systems in Asia. But epidemics and pandemics, and of course a pandemic is just an epidemic on a much wider scale. The WHO today has a technical definition, which means that it crosses it's an epidemic which crosses 2 or 3 continents. But what I'm saying, I guess, about pandemics to some extent applies to any kind of epidemic. They're often seen as judgments upon the society, and that the arrival of an epidemic will often be seen. Sorry, I've been told to step into the light. The arrival of an epidemic will often be seen as indicative of social decay and as a form of divine retribution, a divine punishment. And again, this is something which lingers on for a surprisingly long time. Now, in the modern world, disease, and by the modern world, I'm really here talking about the period from about 1800 or so. Disease is also, at least epidemic and pandemic diseases, are also seen to be indicative of some kind of social crisis, very often on a large scale, obviously in the case of pandemics, a global scale. But the difference is, in the modern period, is that for the first time, these pandemics are on a truly global scale, not just covering 1 or 2 continents, as they often were in the past, say in the case of the so-called Black Death of the 14th century, or some of the later plague epidemics. They were often covering parts of Asia, China west through to the so-called Near East and into Europe, and also affecting North Africa. But they didn't affect other parts of the globe, at least not until the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. But in the 19th century and afterwards, because of revolution in communications, arrival of steamships, railways, because of the emergence of the first truly global economy and trading system, the world essentially shrank, and epidemics could move around the world with startling rapidity. And this was greatly alarming to many people in the 19th century. And also, many new diseases, at least new in most parts of the world, began to emerge. Cholera is a classic example. Until 1817, cholera was confined just to a small part of India, to deltaic Bengal. And in 1817, in the course of a war between the British and some of the Indian states in Western India, the disease spread all over India. And then within a few years, it began to spread out of the country. And by the 1830s, it was in Europe, and later soon came to North America and other parts of the world. So the 19th century appears to be a new age of pandemics. Up until this point, particularly Europe and North America had become quite complacent. In the case of Europe, most parts of Europe had been free from plague for around 100 years or so. And the North Americans believed that disease, or at least epidemic disease, was really something which was confined to the decadent old world. But cholera and the other diseases that began to emerge on a pandemic scale during the 19th century shook people out of that complacency. And for the first time, people began to feel themselves vulnerable to what was happening in quite distant parts of the globe. And disease seemed to underlie that. Some sort of crisis in Asia could give rise to disease, and within perhaps a matter of weeks, the disease may be spread by ship to Europe and other parts of the so-called civilized world. So we have a kind of paradox here. At a time when European civilization both in Europe and in North America is celebrating its achievements, celebrating modernity and progress and industrialization, and the revolution in communications and technology. And these so-called uncivilized parts of the world are threatening to undermine that very civilization through the export of diseases. And of course, the export of diseases is something which is seen to be intimately related to this new global trading system. So there's people increasingly viewing this new world, modern world, with a degree of ambivalence. Now, as I've mentioned, cholera is in some ways one of the sort of touchstone diseases of the 19th century. It symbolizes both the global spread of technology and of the trading system, which is dominated for most of this period, at least, by Great Britain. But it also seems to indicate problems which are arising in many parts of Europe and the industrializing world, as well as indicating the connections between different parts of the globe. It shows up in very stark terms some of the